Hi everyone, lovely to meet you. My name is Sissoko. I'm a designer and researcher, and I'm going to do a training today about understanding people's changing needs in times of uncertainty. So I'm going to be talking about how to use different research methods so that you can better get a sense of what people need right now. My background is as a designer and researcher, and I've been working for the last 10 years or so in the UK, kind of across the UK. For mostly my clients have been charities and the public sector, helping them to solve kind of big challenging issues that they're going through. And so I'm going to spend the first half of this talk kind of trying to convince you about why research is really important when you're trying something new, especially. And then I'm going to move on towards sharing with you some more concrete methods that you can use. So when I do training about research, I really like to start with this slide because I think it's a really concrete example of what happens when you don't do your research. So this is an image, a picture of what we call a desire path. And this is when someone has designed a really lovely, neat little urban environment, but hasn't really looked at how people might want to use the space or where people might want to get to. How do they go from A to B? And therefore what happens is that people just end up cutting through the grass to go where it is that they need to go. And so that to me is an example of, well, not only bad design, but also not having done your research. Not having observed how people use the space, not having asked people how they most want to use the space, and therefore you end up with people just find their own way anyway. But it's not ideal for either the designer or the person using the space because they might just end up walking into muddy puddles as they as they try to get to where they want to get to. So ideally, you do your research and then you design the space according to people's needs. And so my background is in design. So when I think if you've attended the previous talks in this series by Beyond, you will be familiar with this shape. But this is essentially the shape of a design project. So when you're applying design thinking, which is a way to solve a problem. So a problem-solving methodology. So you'll usually start with a problem and you'll spend a bit of time interrogating that problem, investigating that problem, seeing how does it impact on the people who are the most impacted, what are the different factors that are making this an issue, what are other people doing to solve that problem, and then once you feel like you've got a really good understanding of the challenge itself, then you move towards the solution space, which is where you might start testing different approaches with people to see what resonates the most, what might work, and what might actually lead to positive outcomes for them. And the whole process is human-centered, which means that people are at the center of it, and which means that when you're starting your project and when you're first looking at the problem and at the challenge, the questions you're asking is along the lines of what impact are current systems having on the lives of human beings who are actually experiencing this challenge. And then when you move on towards the solution space, the question becomes what impact would my proposition or my idea have on the lives of human beings or of these people. So really the idea is that you're always keeping in mind the needs and aspirations of the people you're designing for. And right now, this is especially important because Well, we are in a pandemic, so people's realities are changing really rapidly. And that means that their needs are also changing really rapidly. It's almost from week to week. What I needed next week might be very different to what I'm going to need next month, for example. And I'm sure you'll be aware of that in your organizations. And when you're trying to connect to your service users or to just people who use your support services, you probably have noticed that as well, that people's situations are changing super fast, and you need, as an organization, as a charity, you need to like be able to keep track of how those needs are changing and adapt your services to that. A second reason why research is really important is that you don't have, or people don't have access to support services in the same way than they used to be. So while before COVID, you might have opportunities for face-to-face, for doing a lot of outreach, a lot of that has moved obviously online, as you know, as you'll have experience. And a lot of people don't have access to kind of online facilities, or it might be challenging for them to access that. So again, research can be a way of finding out what is the best way of providing what you used to provide, and the same kind of quality of support, but in a digital way. And then finally, we are in 2021 now, and inclusion and equality of access has always been really important. Like, it's always been a fact that we need services to reflect the population, and we need services to be equally accessible and treat people equally. But what I think 2020 has highlighted is that it's not always the case. And so when you're thinking about what you're actually providing to people this year, especially and at the moment, you want to consider who is included, who is excluded, and what are you going to do to kind of readdress these imbalances. And again, doing research can be a really useful way of, well, first of all, reaching people that you may not be reaching right now, but also understanding what might be stopping them from accessing the services that you're providing. Maybe it's not the right service, or maybe the language that you use is not the right one, or maybe they don't see themselves reflected in it. And yeah, so it's, again, research provides you with an opportunity to ask those questions around access and inclusion. So before we move on to the more like really practical part of this lecture, these are a few questions to ask yourselves. So how has life changed for your beneficiaries? And do you have an indication of that? How are you adapting your services to their new reality, if you are? And then who are you not reaching? So who is not there? Whose voice are you not hearing? And one thing that's really important before you even decide to do research is, are you ready to hear that your intuitions may be wrong? So when we are at the beginning of a design process, or when we are trying to do something new, sometimes we have an understanding of what the problem is. And then as we dig deeper, we realize that that problem was just a symptom of something that's actually, the root causes is something completely different. And we might need to change our route or change our approach to tackle that root cause. But you won't get to that if you go into research with a set idea of what it is that you want to do. And if what you're looking for is validation of your idea, rather than actually going into it truly open to being challenged. Okay, so let's move on to the more practical side of research. I'm going to introduce a few research methods to you, These are just some of them that I use in my work, but there are other ways of doing things, but I hope these will be useful to you. Okay, so this is an overview, and essentially what you see here is I've kind of mapped the design process in the back, and these methods will be useful to you at different moments. So if you're starting, if you don't have a really sound understanding of the problem that you're tackling, if you feel like it's all very new, or I'm working with a new kind of demographics of people, then you will tend to choose research methods that are closer to the left-hand side, because they're more about generating new insights. And then if you've done the research already, you have a really solid basis that you're building on, and you know roughly what your approach is going to be, or maybe you already have an idea, then you want to use research methods that are more in the kind of, the green corner. So it's less about getting new insights, and it's more about refining your ideas and validating what the directions you're going into. And then I've also mapped them according to whether they give you a lot of depth or whether they kind of remain at the surface. So the one towards the bottom tend to go quite deep and give you quite rich and granular insights, while the ones at the top, they tend to, you can reach a lot more people and you can see trends and patterns, but you won't always be able to understand the why behind the trend that you're seeing. Okay, so the first method that I want to introduce to you is ethnography. So ethnography comes from anthropology, and it's where researchers will try and get a sense of a group of people that are bound by a culture, and they'll try to really understand those people and their culture and their behaviors. And in kind of traditional anthropology, it could take years or months, but we've kind of, as designers, we've kind of taken that and adapted it to the kind of fast pace of the design world. And it's what it looks like is more like a day in the life of somebody. So typically you would be maybe meeting someone in their home or in a context that they're familiar with. You would kind of come in with some questions, but you'll also have enough space during the time that you're with them, just for kind of informal conversation, observation, for them to kind of show you their life as they want you to see it. So it's about, understanding people's needs and behaviors and aspirations in their own context. And obviously that's quite a significant amount of time that you might be spending with people. So from a few hours to maybe a day, sometimes a couple of days over time, where you return to people. And so that requires some quite careful planning, especially when it comes to ethical considerations, but I'll come to that a little bit later. And I know that because of the situation we're in right now, it's really difficult to do that face-to-face. So there are remote alternatives for doing this. So for example, giving people online journals to fill up, getting them to do like a photography or video diary, and then you might reflect on what they've sent you with like a kind of video call. And then there are some online tools as well that can help you to do all of this. So ethnography is very much for when you're trying to get deep, and when you're trying to get new insights on a challenge. So that's ethnography. The second research method that I want to talk to you about is peer research. And that's when you you're working with a group or community and you want to, you're actually employing people from that group or from that community to help you with the research and to conduct interviews themselves, or with you in tandem with the researchers. And this is really useful because even if empathy is a skill that can be grown, your own empathy has limits, because we all come as researchers, we're never completely neutral. We all come with our own experience and our own biases, and so your empathy does have limit, especially if you're working with people whose background or whose experiences are like miles removed from what you've experienced in life. So when it comes to that, peers, working with peers can be really useful. Also because people can be more likely to open up to peers. And then peer researchers can also help you to interpret the data more truthfully. So in the past, when I've worked with peer researchers, they might know even just the local language that's used to describe something, which might completely go over my head. And they might point out to me when we're reflecting on the interview, actually what that person said here was really important because of this context and this context. And yeah, so making use of peers and making sure that you train them up properly and that you pay them as well, obviously, as a member of your team, can be really useful and really rich and enrich your research process. I'm gonna quickly have a look at the questions because I think they probably relate to what I've just talked about. So could you give examples about how you design ethnography research in the past, what went well and what didn't? Yes, I could give you a lot of examples. I think I might keep that question for the end. I'm going to keep a note of it and keep it for the end. Okay. So one other thing that you can do and that can give you quite a lot of insight on a problem that you're researching is obviously expert interviews. So that's where you just look for people who are experts in a field that you're researching. So for example, if you're doing a project around depression or around early years or around anything else, you look for people who might know a lot about it. And experts can be community members or they can be professionals. Like, to me, there is distinction, but we should be mindful of what we define as expertise. And you just do short interviews with them. And that's a good way of getting qualitative insights quite quickly and to get up to speed with the latest thinking about your topic, and to really maybe get an overview of what it is that you're researching. So it can be really useful, for example, at the very early stage of research. Yeah. So just to give you an example of this, at the moment I'm working on a project which is about learning a new language as a migrant. So I've started the process by talking to a psychologist who works mostly with migrants, and we explored the challenges of settling into a new place. And so I had a good frame in my mind when I then went and interviewed people who are learning a second language. I had a good frame of what it means to settle into a new place, what it means to try and belong, what it means to try and find a home. And obviously that influenced all of my conversations about language. So yeah, and these are quite helpful and quick to organize. They could be on the phone or in person when the world allows. Probably no longer than a couple of hours, and it's less focused on them and their personal life, but more about getting their expert opinion. So quite straightforward. And then when you want to go a little bit broader, so with ethnography or peer research, obviously that's quite time intensive, and you go into quite a lot of depth. So you kind of want to reserve that for when you really want deep insights, and you're not so much bothered about getting a wide reflective view of the problem. When you need to go a little bit broader, obviously, you could do surveys, but you could also do public engagement. With public engagement in a kind of normal world or pre-COVID world, what that might look like is you find, for example, if you're trying to implement a service or start something new in a new neighborhood, you might find like a market or community fair and do some kind of on-street engagement, or you might, I don't know, just basically it's all about finding people where they are. Obviously now online, this looks very different. But the idea with public engagement is that you're calling on people to share quite a lot of diverse view on a very specific questions. So the example I want to show you here is from Mind. They did that a few years ago, the mental health charity, where it's a project that was called Postcards from Somewhere. And they just asked people, they built a really simple website where people could pick an image and just write one message, where they described a place where they go to when they're struggling with their mental health, or to help them cope with something they're going through. And then they put all of these postcards together, and people could kind of browse them. So I think that was used more in the context of a campaign, but it could also be used as research, where you have one quite simple question that you want to ask people about their changing needs, or something that has never been really asked before. And yeah, you can do that online quite easily. So on here, I've got another couple of examples that you can check out of tools that enable you to do that kind of wide-ranging research. But one thing to say about public engagement is that really often it's quite surface level, so it's for breadth and kind of top level insight, rather than going quite deep into people's experiences. And as you're moving in your process, as you're moving from research or problem towards solution, you might also want to look at co-design workshops. So typically that looks like it's a creative group session where you get service users and different stakeholders to maybe gather feedback on a specific idea that you have, or to generate an idea themselves. So to give you an example, this image is taken from a project I did a few years ago, which was around redesigning, or it was about working with schools to find solutions to make their food culture healthier. And what we did is, well, we started the project by doing a little bit of research and interviews with different people in the school community. But then we presented those insights back to them, and we held a few workshops where we had the pupils from each, like, different age groups, as well as a few teachers, maybe the PE teacher, maybe the school chef, etc. And they formed a little team, and they had to, for example, here, I think what they were doing is they were redesigning their canteen to encourage healthy behaviors. So that typically can be like a few hours long session, preferably in a place where your users are familiar with. But you can also move that online, where you organize a Zoom call pretty much similar to this, and then you can use apps like Mural and Miro or Miro, similar names and similar aims, but two different apps, which is essentially like having a shared whiteboard that everyone can access and write things on, and so creative session. And then finally, when you already have a product or an idea, then you can move to usability testing, which is more, say you're, in this case, for example, you're building an app, you're going to build the very minimum version of this app, so the most technically simple, and then you're going to get people to interact with it, and test it and tell you what it is that they like, what it is that doesn't work for them, where do they get blocked, where what makes them want to give up, etc. And through this, what you're really doing is you're watching people using an early version of your product or your service, but you're doing that early, before you've put in all your energy into actually building the real thing. And you can do that more easily with products, but you can also do that with services. So, for example, through role playing, or through just having a kind of taster session of what it is that you're aiming to offer. So, for example, if it's like a program, you could offer a taster session and then get people to give you feedback on what worked and what didn't work. And yeah. But that's more for like the end of the process. That's when you're really confident about what it is that you're testing and what it is that you're putting out into the world. And you're more looking for validation or small tweaks. So I will keep this kind of testing for towards the end of a project. Okay, so before we move on, I have a few more questions for you, which is, what are you actually looking for with research? Are you looking for new insights? Are you looking for new ideas? Or are you looking for just validation that you're heading in the right direction? Yeah, and I'm asking that because, of course, based on what it is that you need, you will choose different research methods. Okay. And I'm going to move on to some practical considerations that you need to take into account when you're planning your research. So the first one, and the question that I always get asked, is, who should I talk to, and how do I know who to talk to, and how do I know how many people I need in my sample? So let's talk about segmentation a little bit. So I have this tool here, which I find really useful when I start a project. And I have a version of this tool that will be sent to you and that you can then use for your own projects. So it's to think about who is already benefiting from what you're doing. And then you can start asking questions, and what can I ask them about what they've experienced with me or with my organizations? Who else could benefit from what I'm doing? And in that case, then the question becomes more, and how can I reach them? Or like, what can I learn about them that will tell me why they're not already accessing my service? Or or what else could I do so that my service becomes more beneficial to them as well? And then finally, who could help you learn about the issue that you're trying to solve? So essentially, experts or people who've already solved what you're trying to solve, but in another context, maybe in another country or another region. So you should aim to include people from each of those categories in your research. So people you already kind of know, but who might give you a new perspective on what you're doing, people that you don't know and would benefit from you reaching out to them, and then people who are more like, who you could draw on their expertise to design what it is that you're designing. And when I think about segmentation, obviously you can think about demographics. So for example, I'm designing this project and it will be really useful for me to talk to, say, young people with who are experiencing a mental health issue. But it's also useful to think about behaviors and mindsets or the barriers that they might be experiencing. So for example, yes, I might want to talk to young people who are experiencing mental health issues, maybe for the first time, but I also want to consider what might be stopping them. And then those barriers might help me to actually be a little bit more defined about who it is that I'm looking for. And a very important point when you're doing your preparing your segmentation is to remember that anyone who's not included in your research is excluded from it, even if it's not intentional, and even if I know that resources are scarce and you can't talk to everybody in the country or in the world. But it's just a reminder that it takes really careful consideration to think about, if you're not reaching a particular demographics, then why are they not included, and do you have a rationale for it? So that's about segmentation. And then you move on to recruitment, so actually finding the people that you need to talk to. And typically what I will do in that stage is I will make a list of all the kinds of organizations or all the kinds of groups that these people might be in touch with. And then I'll just try and go through them. So try and build on existing, reach people through existing networks. But then if you're trying to reach people who might be quite isolated, then obviously that's an added challenge, and you'll have to be creative with how you find people in that category. But one question I also get asked all the time when it comes to recruitment is, how many people do I go for? And the answer is always, obviously, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to find out and how deep you want to go. So if you go for quantity, so say 40 or 50 participants or more, then what you'll find is that really quickly you start seeing some patterns that get repeated. And then the questions that you're asking when you have quite a big sample, they're more about along the lines of like, what's going on and what are the trends, and they tend to be less about the depth. So when you go for a smaller number, you might think, well, actually, what I'm going to hear from a smaller number is not valid enough, but it is still valid, even if it's quite a small number, because you might go more in depth. And then you will find that after a while, say if you have 15, 16, 20 people, you start hearing the same things over and over again, and then that's when you know roughly that you've included enough people. So yeah, I hope this makes sense. I tend to go for depth, just because of the nature of what I'm trying to do is trying to get into some deeper kind of behavioral insights, and like trying to understand people's motivations. And it's less about trying to understand trends or trying to understand what's going on at like a wider population level. Then once you've decided who you're going to talk to, the next challenge is around framing your questions. And to me, and again, I've included a tool which you're going to receive after today. But what I like to use is this tool, which is like, I will generally sit down with my team and we'll map everything that we know, or at least that we think we know about a particular problem. And that's usually should be backed by data. And then I will map everything that we assume as a team. And generally what we assume is maybe based on experience, or maybe based on stories that we've heard, or based on our own kind of, biases or perspective that we bring to this research as individuals. And then finally, we'll map everything that we don't know about this problem. And if you receive the tool after today, there is an example there that's broken down. And then essentially your research questions will tend to be around what you assume and what you don't know. Because what you know, obviously you already know it, you don't need to test it, but your assumptions and your unknowns are things that you will go into the field with. And I try to always frame my questions around like barriers and enablers. So it's less about going into it checking, do people behave like this? But it's more what's enabling people to achieve what they want to achieve, or what's stop preventing people from achieving what they want to achieve. And these are some more examples of how you can frame your questions going into research. And as researchers, we need to be really aware of our biases that are not just based on our own experience, but also, for example, confirmation bias is when you're only asking or hearing what you already believe to be true. So you're going into research and you're not really open for being challenged. And that's the framing of the question can change that. So for example, if you ask people, would you like to see more supports to help victims of domestic violence? Then obviously the answer is going to be yes, that's very likely. But if you ask people what has been your experience of seeking help to escape domestic violence, for example, then you get an answer that's, first of all, a lot richer. You get a story as well as a kind of yes or no or opinion. But you also, as the person answers this question, you'll get little nuggets of insights about what's been helpful for that person, what's not been helpful for that person, what's been valuable, what's been hard, what's been challenging. And then you can include all of those kind of challenges and enablers into the way you end up designing the support that you're trying to design. The second bias that's really important to be aware of is called social desirability bias. It's when basically we want, as human beings, all of us, we want to be like, and we don't like to show our failures. So if you're, for example, trying to get, say, insights on a product or a service that already exists, and you want to find out how people have accessed it, like were there any barriers in them being able to access it, instead of asking what did you find difficult, which is a very valid question in itself, because as a designer you'd want to solve those difficulties. If you ask what would you do to improve this, then the person that you're talking to is more likely to come up with they'll probably come up with a lot of solutions for improvement. While if you ask what did you find difficult, then it's more like you're pointing out what they didn't succeed at doing, and it's more likely that they will kind of, oh no, it's fine, that was really easy, and then you're not really getting the depth of insight that you're hoping to get. Okay, let's move on. So I want to tell you a little bit about interview methods, because obviously that's present in every research method that I've shared so far. The most important is to be really it's less about what you've prepared coming into the interviews. It's less about the questions list, and it's less about the tools that you might bring into it, and it's more about you as a researcher, how you are present, and how you're showing that you're actually present, that you're really listening, and that you're kind of attentive to discomfort and like micro emotions that might be going on for that person, that might not be kind of easily perceptible, but it's kind of ensuring that you make enough space for that person to express that discomfort, for example. Allow silence if, silence is fine during interviews, where sometimes silence can allow someone to come back with something deeper, or to actually say what it is that they really wanted to say. I do that all the time when I'm being asked a question. I feel the pressure to answer it, so I'll answer something, but that thing might not necessarily be true, or it might not go as deep as I wanted to. But if you allow silence after the person initially answered the question, then really often they will come back to what they've said and say, like, actually, what I mean is this. So silence is probably one of your most powerful tools in interview, as well as, just body language and things like that, just being able to read people, but also projecting a kind of presence that makes people comfortable. And what I really like to use as well are visual tools, because I think that they can really help the conversation to stay focused. And for example, they work really well with children and young people. So for example, the last picture here is actually a game that I developed when I was doing research with young carers. So young people who are looking after a family member because of an illness or a mental illness. And what I found is that when we were doing interviews just one-to-one, they were quite open with their experiences. But then when we moved into more of a group situation, where we were trying to get them to collaborate together to design the service that they wanted to see, what I found is that it was actually quite challenging for them to participate, because they felt like they needed to bring quite a lot of themselves or their own experience into the conversation. So we designed this game where it's basically just like a role-playing game, where we would have a scenario, we would share with them a scenario that's something that's likely to happen to a young carer. And then each of them would take on the role of, say, a social worker, a GP, a head teacher, a friend, and they will be able to, by putting themselves into the shoes of other people, to kind of say how they would like that person to react, or what they would like that person to do in this situation. And the conversation then became really rich and really also really practical. So they were able to share the experience without really putting the attention of the group on them as an individual. So you can be quite creative with the tools that you bring into research. Another example here in the middle is like a timeline, where I'm trying to get a sense of what people have been through before I meet them. So it's just mapping good times and bad times. And sometimes it's about their whole life. Sometimes it's just about their experience of a service. Yeah, but I find those useful. And once you've done your fieldwork, the challenge will be about, how do I make sense about everything that I've heard? And generally that process looks a little bit like this. So it's quite messy, a lot of notes everywhere, a wall of post-its. It's usually quite overwhelming. But I find that there are some like just little ways of phrasing questions which are helpful. So how can we and what if generally help me to move from like a sea of insight to actually some really specific challenges and opportunities that I think I need to solve, or that the project needs to solve. And I think the next session is going to tell you a little bit more about this, like how to make the most of your research when you move towards the design phase. So I'm not going to spend too long on this. Okay, so let's do a tiny little pause and ask, so who can give you insight into how people experience the problem that you are researching? How can you build a relationship of trust with those people? And then how are you going to use those insights to shape your ideas? So again, when you're starting to think really practically about your research, the who and the how are the most important questions, especially that middle one. How are you going to build a relationship of trust with them? How are you going to make sure that not only they trust you to open up to you, but also they actually feel comfortable throughout the process? Okay, and I'm just going to end with some ethical considerations, because obviously that's really important to research and to any kind of interactions or involvement with people. The first one is around consent and gifts. So obviously when you go into research and people sign up to be part of your research, to have an interview with you, they need to know how you're going to use their data. They need to know what it's for, who is going to see their stories, whether it's going to be anonymized or not. So all of that goes onto a consent form, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But what I want to say to you is that informed consent is more than just a form. So for example, if you're doing an interview with someone, it might be about at different moments during the interview, not just at the beginning once they've signed the form, but at different moments during the interview, it might be about asking them, are you okay if we move on to that topic? Like, are you okay talking about this? Or like reminding them throughout the interview that they have a right to stop being part of the research process. And basically just making them understand that they are in control of their participation. And then the second another consideration that's really important is around gifts or reward or pay, however you want to call it, paying participants for their time. To me, it's very, very, very important, and because you are taking their time, simply, and also because some communities are just researched over and over and over again, and people come in and ask a lot of invasive questions and leave, and then that community doesn't really see what's happened as a result of their involvement. So transparency about what's going to happen as a result of the research, but also just rewarding people because they are because without them you just wouldn't have research, you wouldn't have insights. So to me that's really, really key. And then equity. So who do you never hear from and why, and how can you make sure that they are part of your research, and that in the way you design your research, you're actually giving them some kind of agency or power. So they're not just kind of, again, what I just said, they're not just being researched and done to, and then let's move on to the next project, but they actually, they feel a sense of power in your process. And then remembering that people are not hard to reach, organizations are. To me, that is really important, because we often hear that, oh, this community, they will never engage with us. They're hard to reach. They just, there is no way to reach them. But actually, it's not like people are not hard to reach. People just are. They exist in their lives. They have their own lives, their own priorities. But it's organizations and services that are seen as like out of reach, or maybe not even in the picture for a lot of people. That's something to remember. And then finally, well-being. So especially at this time, during a pandemic where everyone is stressed, a lot of people are overstretched. I mean, this is important all the time, but especially now. So your first responsibility is to the participant, not the data. So for example, if you think you're going to do research that will potentially touch on some traumas, even if you're not aware of it, sometimes you will, even kind of unintendedly. Is that a word? Without the intention to. So your first responsibility is to the participant, not the data, even if it means that you have to stop an interview. And even if it means that you have to recommend so something that we did in the summer, for example, when we did this project around food insecurity, we then sent like a participant well-being pack to everyone who had taken part in interviews. And that included an offer to speak to a counselor if people felt like they needed to, even if it wasn't related to the research, and it was just, if you need space to vent, we have this in place for you. So when you're planning your research, think about what might be harmful for people, or what might be uncomfortable for people, and then try and plan around it so that you're actually doing the research safely. And then remember that researchers also need care. So sometimes you come out of an interview and it was really difficult, and maybe you really feel angry for the context that the person is in. So make sure that as a researcher, you also have space yourself to vent and to get support when you need to, because otherwise you're not, if you kind of carry on carrying that trauma or that anger or those emotions along with you, then you won't really be able to do good research and to engage properly with others. Okay, I think I need to speed up, but I think that's the end, basically. Yeah, so my last question is, how will you ensure this is not just a useful experience for you, but also a positive experience for participants? That's it. I think we have a tiny bit of time for questions. Emily?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ban. I think we've possibly got time for one question. So I've been gathering lots from the chat. We're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions, I'm afraid. Sorry. I've got a question here. It says, our service has been remote because of the risks to users with long-term conditions, but many of our users don't have access to the internet, and it's causing huge difficulties. Do you have any advice maybe you could share there?
Around research, I think it is challenging. I think if you're in a position where you can offer, for example, phone credits to your participants, or if you can, offer to actually buy data or like cover data for them, so that they can engage in the research activities that you've designed, then that can be really useful and really appreciated. You can also think about like non-digital ways of interacting or getting insights from people. So for example, designing a research pack with different questions in there, and then some tools and activities, and send that to them by the good old post, and then with a prepaid envelope so that they can send it back. That's also a possibility. but yeah, try and maybe cover their data if they're going to have to like engage with you a lot online.
Oh, that's really helpful. Thanks so much. So thank you so much, Fan, and thank you everybody for joining. There's been some fantastic questions, loads of really great chat. I can see you helping each other out as well, which is really exciting. We're going to be sharing the slides and the recording on the blog, so you can look forward to that. I'm also popping in the chat a feedback form that I'd really appreciate it if you could quickly fill in. It will help us learn from this experience and keep improving beyond. We'd also love it if you would like to share your comments and experience on Twitter at join_beyond. That would be very welcome. So we've got some really exciting events coming over the next few weeks. I wanted to do a quick shout out for the same time next Tuesday. We're going to have Teo joining us again to look at turning insights into ideas. So it's the next step in this journey from research, and how do you turn that into ideas to improve your services. And then we also have on Monday evenings sessions on the power of storytelling, which I'd really encourage you to sign up to on the website. But thank you, everybody, and thank you once again to Pan for really insightful and I think quite inspiring session. There's been some great comments already. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Have a lovely rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.